So, in the history of all things motorsport, there have been many times where a driver or a rider has deserved to win a title, but for whatever reason has ended up coming up short, such as John Cullen in the 1992 BTCC season, Mikko Hirvonen in the 2009 WRC season, Juan Pablo Montoya in the 2015 IndyCar season, and Fabio Quartararo in the 2022 MotoGP season. All four of these examples I've made a video about in the past. But whilst these examples are very well known, there's one that sticks out in my mind that trumps all of these completely, and is arguably the biggest bottle job you will ever see in the history of motorsport, with this example taking place in the World Superbike Championship. Let me introduce to you Alvaro Bautista and his lost title in 2019. After spending 9 years in the premier class of MotoGP, where he would only achieve 3 podiums and a highest finish of 5th in the championship, Alvaro, as a result of the Angel Nieto team merging with the Sepang Racing team, would make the switch to the World Superbike Championship from 2019, riding for the Ducati factory team as a result of his connections with Ducati when he was in MotoGP. While there was a lot of expectations for Alvaro heading into the season, ultimately there wasn't many people who were backing him to win the title, as for the last few years, the championship had been dominated by the Kawasaki of Jonathan Rea, who, after winning his 4th title in convincing fashion in 2018, was expected to win the title again in 2019, with him looking to break Carl Fogarty's record for the most championships in WSBK. But going into 2019, there was a new race format that was being introduced for WSBK, as after many years of the series using the conventional 2-race format, the series would add a 3rd race to the mix, which would take place in between race 1 and 2, specifically on Sunday mornings, and would be known as the Super Pole race, which would be a 10-lap sprint race and would see points being handed down to the top 9 riders, with the point system being on your screen right now. But even with this new format, many people weren't expecting the pecking order to change because of it, and by the time qualifying came around for the first meeting at Phillip Island, that looked to be the case, as Jonathan Rea would grab the first pole of the season, beating his teammate Leon Haslam by 0.2 of a second, with Alvaro Bautista a further 10th back in 3rd. But come race 1, it would be a completely different story, as at the start, Bautista would manage to get the 2 Kawasaki's within the first 3 corners to grab the lead of the race, and to the surprise of everyone, he would manage to pull away, and in his first attempt in WSBK, he would grab his first ever win, beating reigning champion Jonathan Rea by a massive 14.9 seconds. Safe to say, this caught people massively off guard, and if that wasn't enough, Bautista would repeat this for the rest of the weekend, beating Rea by just under 1.2 seconds in the Super Pole race, and then a massive 12.1 seconds in race 2 to give himself an early 13-point lead after the first meeting. A massive slap in the face to Kawasaki, but with Phillip Island having a reputation for being a Ducati track, it wasn't too much of a surprise that Bautista won all 3 races, with the only surprise being the massive gap the Spaniard had on Rea in both the main races. And with that in mind, many people were expecting normal service to resume when the WSBK fraternity arrived at Buriram in Thailand. But to everyone's surprise, this was not the case, as in qualifying, Bautista would continue the momentum from Phillip Island to grab his first ever pole position, obliterating the lap record in the process, being the only rider to get into the 1:31s, with the gap between himself and second place Jonathan Rea being a massive 0.4 of a second. And just like at Phillip Island, Bautista would dominate all 3 races, making it 6 out of 6 wins, giving himself a comfortable 26-point lead ahead of Rea, who once again had to settle for second in all 3 races. And this would end up being a repeat at the next meeting at Aragon, as another convincing pole lap was followed by another comfortable 3 wins ahead of Rea, who, it's safe to say at this point, may have already been questioning whether he was able to retain his crown from 2018, with Bautista clearly being a threat to him in the early part of the season. The next meeting at Assen would see the Superpole race getting cancelled due to race 1 being pushed back to Sunday as a result of the track being hit with snow. But even despite this, that didn't stop Bautista from grabbing another pole and winning both races, with him extending the gap in the championship to a massive 53 points as a result of Rea finishing 3rd in race 2, losing more ground to Alvaro than he would have liked. This would see Alvaro set a new record in the process, breaking Neil Hodgson's record for the most consecutive wins at the beginning of a season. But at the next meeting at IMLA, Alvaro's streak of wins would come to an end, as in that meeting, which would see race 2 getting cancelled due to torrential rain, Rea would finally beat Alvaro to claim his first 2 wins of the season, with Alvaro being strangely off the pace in both race 1 and the Superpole race, with him finishing 2nd and 3rd respectively, even being off pace compared to his teammate Chaz Davies, who managed to get pole for that meeting. But at Jerez, despite not taking pole, Alvaro would get back to winning ways, winning both race 1 and the Superpole race to bring the gap back up between himself and Rea to a massive 61 points. But in race 2, Alvaro's weekend would literally come crashing down, as on lap 2, Alvaro would fall off his bike at turn 1, putting himself out of contention for points, let alone a podium or a win. And although he would get going again, he wouldn't be classified in the final race results due to being 9 laps down on eventual winner Michael van der Mark. And with Rea finishing 2nd, the gap between the pair of them would come down to 41 points. Still a healthy gap, but little did we know at the time that this fall at Jerez would end up being the start of Alvaro's downfall. At Misano, Rea would grab his 3rd win of the season in race 1, with Alvaro finishing in 3rd after being strangely off the pace again, but he would make amends by taking victory in the Superpole race, with Rea strangely finishing down in 5th. However, in race 2, Bautista would once again fall off his bike on lap 2, being only able to recover to 14th, whilst Rea would take full advantage to grab his 4th win of the season, which would end up having a big effect on the championship, as after having such a healthy lead going into the weekend, Rea had managed to slash the gap down to Alvaro to just 16 points. And it would only get worse for Alvaro at the next meeting at Donington, as in race 1, he would once again crash out of the race, this time in dramatic fashion at turn 6, suffering from a high side. This, as a result, saw Rea, who went on to win the race, take the lead in the championship for the first time all season, which he would increase as the weekend went on, with him also winning the Superpole race and race 2, whilst Bautista, who was off the pace all weekend, finished in 4th and 3rd respectively in those 2 races. This meant that coming out of the weekend, Rea led the championship by 24 points ahead of Alvaro, with the momentum now shifting in his favour. Then came Laguna Seca, and by far Alvaro's worst meeting of the 2019 season, which would end up being a defining moment in the outcome of the championship. After being off the pace again compared to Rea, Alvaro would once again fall off his bike at turn 5, dropping him out of the points and only being able to finish 17th. Then in the Superpole race, things would go from bad to worse for him, as on the first lap, Alvaro would once again crash out of the race following contact with future rival Toprak Razgatlioglu at turn 2, leaving the Spaniard with a separation on his shoulder. The injury would leave Alvaro struggling for strength in race 2, which would lead to him pulling into the garage on lap 2, leaving him with no points by the end of the meeting. And with Rea winning race 1 and the Superpole race, along with him grabbing a 2nd place finish in race 2, it meant that as the weekend came to a close, Rea had grown the lead to a massive 81 points ahead of Alvaro, with just 4 meetings remaining. What looked to be an easy championship to start with looked to be a tall order as the championship reached the closing stages, with Alvaro even admitting that it was going to be tough for him to turn the huge point deficit around in his favour. And this would only grow even further at the next meeting at Portimao, as although Bautista would return to winning race in race 2 after a close fight with Jonathan Rea, Rea would still walk away from the weekend with a bigger lead, thanks to him winning race 1 on the Superpole race, with Bautista only finishing race 1 in a disappointing 4th. This meant that heading into Magny-Cours, Rea led the standings by 91 points ahead of Bautista, and providing certain results went his way, he could wrap up the title with 2 meetings to spare. And sadly for Alvaro, that's exactly what Rea would end up doing, as another crash in race 2, combined with 2 disappointing 5th place finishes in race 1 and the Superpole race, would see Rea win a record-breaking 5th World Superbike title in race 2, taking the record away from fellow Brit Carl Fogarty. Alvaro would grab another win at San Juan in Argentina, but the damage was already done, and when the season came to a close, the final gap in the end between himself and Rea was a massive 165 points, with Rea winning 5 of the remaining 6 races, bringing his total to 17 wins, 1 more than Alvaro. And with that, the biggest bottle job in the history of motorsport had been completed. And whilst there have been bigger points deficits that have been turned around in other series, MotoGP says hi, this for me is a bigger bottle than that, as whilst the majority of Fabio Quartararo's bottle was down to his Yamaha losing ground to Pecco's Ducati, this one was all down to Alvaro, as after having a streak of 11 race wins at the beginning of the season, it felt like after he got himself a 61 point lead ahead of Rea, he started to get a bit too carried away, which led to mistakes in his riding, which often led to dramatic consequences. And with Rea constantly finishing second behind Alvaro, it allowed the Northern Irishman to capitalise whenever Alvaro would crack under pressure. And the more mistakes he made, it allowed the momentum to swing very easily into Johnny's lap, something that Alvaro would never get back. After being delivered a sucker punch in his first year in WSBK, Alvaro would end up leaving Ducati at the end of the season and would end up joining Honda, partnering alongside Leon Haslam, who left Kawasaki at the end of that same year. The partnership would end up being an unsuccessful one, as Honda were nowhere near challenging at the front to mount any sort of attack on Jonathan Rea, who would go on to win his 6th World Superbike title in the pandemic-affected 2020 season. After another uncompetitive year in 2021, a year which saw Toprak end Johnny Rea's streak of titles, Alvaro would end up leaving Honda at the end of the season and would return to Ducati from 2022, once again competing at the front and being involved in a titanic scrap for the title with Jonathan Rea and Toprak Razgatlioglu. And after the disappointment of 2019, Alvaro would get his redemption to claim his first ever World Superbike title, beating Toprak by 32 points. Alvaro would go on to retain his crown in 2023, this time in more convincing fashion, before losing the title in 2024 to Toprak Razgatlioglu, thanks to the new weight rules that were introduced at the start of the year, which ended up holding Alvaro back thanks to him being one of the lightest riders on the grid. Alvaro is still competing with Ducati in 2025, but he is currently being outpaced by his younger teammate Nicola Bulega, with some speculating that Alvaro could retire at the end of the year, given he came close to retiring at the end of last year. But regardless of whether he does decide to call it a day or not after this year, at least Alvaro was able to put the demons of 2019 behind him and win 2 titles back to back, as if he didn't, his legacy in the series would have been remembered in an unfortunate way.